Well, friends, as has already been mentioned, if you didn't get a copy of the handout and maybe you like to do it electronically a little bit better, on my profile, I've linked for you 4 documents that I hope are helpful for you. One will be all of the slides that we cover today. The second is a handout, the handout that hopefully you received when you came in, and if not, you can just download that one. The third is a resource guide, so it's a 4-page resource guide on topics related to sexuality, gender identity, gender dysphoria, and that will be a really helpful resource, I think, for you as you're looking to make recommendations to people. The fourth one, which I created specifically for Rooted, is a parent resource to help parents navigate gender conversations with their children. And a lot of those parent pathways conversation starters will kind of mirror what we're going to be talking about here in this class today. So hopefully that can be a resource that you can photocopy and hand out to parents as they're navigating these conversations. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. I want to start off with 2 just observations. I am happily married to my wife, Jennifer. We've been married for 18 years. I have 4 daughters, 15, 13, 11, and 9. So in my house, early on, we watched a ton of Disney movies. I know all of them by heart, the animated ones. And you guys will probably remember in Little Mermaid, in the animated version, there's this scene, a fascinating scene where Ariel has gone down to her cave of wonders, and she has all of these collections of forks. And she brings one of them to the surface, and she's talking to Scuttle the seagull, who's the authority on all things human. And she says, "Hey, what are these? What are these things, and what are they supposed to be used for?" And Scuttle very authoritatively says, "Oh, I know exactly what those are. They're called dingle hoppers. And the humans, they use those to brush their hair. That's what they're there for." And, Ariel gets really excited, and she goes down, and she's, collecting all of them and whatnot. Fast forward later on in the story, right, after she gets her legs and she's having that first meal with Prince Eric and the rest of the family, right, she sees the forks there at the table. And you'll remember what she does. She picks up one of the forks and she starts furiously brushing out her hair with the fork. And everybody's around her looking at her with somewhat curious faces because they realize, right, like that's really odd. That's really weird. That is not what forks are made for. And friends, in so many ways, I think that this is culturally what we have done both with sex and especially with gender. We think we know what sex and gender are for. We think we know what the intended purposes of it are for. And so because of that, we just do whatever we want to with it. But that's really not the purpose and design with which God has designed and created gender, meaning that a lot of times culturally, I would say people believe that sex and gender is just a means towards self-expression. It's a way that I express and that I live out my authentic self. And for many of us, that's just culturally acceptable. That's just what you do, which is why I think it's so important as caregivers and as shepherds and as ministry leaders that we really have to reclaim and restore and then pass on the biblical story of sexuality, which I'm not going to go into detail because I trust that you're all sensible, wise people and already know the biblical story of sexuality and gender. The second observation I want to make is that we oftentimes underestimate how much the world has formed our views on sex and gender, right? We'll do a little thought experiment and then we'll read the Carl Trueman quote. Imagine if 50 to 100 years ago, right, one of us, a speaker came on stage in a public setting and said, "I am a woman trapped in a man's body." What would the response be? Right? The response would probably be nervous laughter, significant concern, you need mental health counseling, you need to go talk to your therapist, we need to get this person off the stage. It would definitely be an area of concern for us because we would probably think to ourselves, that's not right. You probably have some type of disorder that needs to be treated. Now, flash forward to the present. Imagine a person gets up on a public stage and they say, "Hey, I am a woman trapped in a man's body." What would be the response there? Right? It would be applause, affirmation, acceptance. If anything, it would probably just be indifference, right? It would just be a shrug of the shoulders. "Hey, good for you. That works for you. We're happy for you." Carl Trueman writes this. He says, "The fact that I am a woman trapped in a man's body, the fact that that makes sense to Joe Smith probably has far less to do with him being committed to an elaborate understanding of the nature of gender and its relationship to biological sex than to the fact that it just seems intuitively correct to affirm someone in his or her chosen identity and hurtful not to do so, however strange the particulars of that self-identification might have seemed to previous generations, right? And this is, I think, oftentimes one of the big hurdles that we're oftentimes up against in ministry is that the way that we come into an understanding of what is right and wrong, what is good as it relates to sex and gender, the way that we do those conversations has significantly shifted. And so towards that point, I just want to ask a question for all of us to consider. Why don't people accept the Bible's teaching on sex and gender like they used to? Well, I'll make a quick observation. Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist, wrote a book, his probably well-known book that many of you are familiar with is called The Anxious Generation. But years ago, he published an earlier book called The Righteous Mind, and he talked about how this current generation comes into an understanding of what's right or wrong, what's moral or what's not. And he says there's been a significant shift in that people don't look to a source of absolute truth like the Bible to come into their sense of what's right or wrong. He said, instead what happens is people develop these moral taste buds. He calls them these moral taste buds, or just to even knock it down further on the shelf, he calls them just gut feelings. We all just have these gut feelings about what is good or what is bad, what is right or what's wrong. And so he gives three, he actually gives six, but we'll just use these first three for the benefit of our time together today. The first moral taste bud, or the first test, is a given action harmful or not? Is a given action harmful or not? And again, you take stuff related to gender identity and gender ideology, and you're a young person today, and you ask that question, hey, is being gay or lesbian or bisexual or trans, is it hurting anybody? Is it hurting you? Is it encroaching in on any of your freedoms? Is it making your life any more difficult? Is it going to be a harmful thing if your neighbor, your son's teacher, so-and-so comes out as gay? And the answer would be no. And because the answer is no, because there is no harm involved, ergo, it must be right. It must be okay. The second test, or the second moral taste bud that Haidt identifies is a given action freeing or is it oppressive? Is a given action freeing or oppressive? And Haidt says, well, listen, when you look at the landscape, right, there's one group in particular who the current generation would say is trying to be more oppressive and less freeing. That's Christians. It's people who are holding to some sense of absolute truth. And we want to be on the, quote, right side of history. We want to be people who are pro-freedom, not pro-oppression. And so anything that smacks or smells or has the sense of being oppressive, we have to get away from. We want to be on the side of freedom. We want to give people free choice. We want to give people the ability to express themselves however it is meant to be. Third test that Haidt notes is a given action fair or discriminatory, right? And you look at the biblical ethic, and it seems like Haidt notes that Christians are being discriminatory to people that they don't like, people whose beliefs they don't want to tolerate or that they don't want to espouse. And so again, we want to be on the side of fairness, injustice, and equality. So you take these three moral taste buds or these gut feelings, you can easily see, right, how the conversations that we do about sex and gender oftentimes completely cross paths with people that we're leading, because the way that we typically come into an understanding of what is right or wrong, especially as it relates to conversations of sex and gender, is not even the same way that generationally and culturally the current generation is having those conversations, right? In our culture, sex and gender is no longer seen as a way to honor God and create and nurture new human life. Most people just believe that sex is a personal and private choice that's primarily about self-expression, right? It's kind of like the dinglehopper in Ariel, right? Everybody's kind of content. Listen, if you want to use a fork to brush your hair, no big deal. It works, right? I can tell you from personal experience, you really could use a fork to brush your hair, but that's not the intended design for what God made it, right? It's not the intended design for the fork. This cultural engine that kind of drives some of these moral taste buds is something that you're probably all very familiar with. It would be this engine or this cultural narrative of expressive individualism. You'll remember David Foster Wallace, an acclaimed American novelist. He gave a commencement speech at Kenyon College in the early 2000s entitled "This is Water." And David Foster Wallace gives a story at the very beginning of that speech, and he talks about these two younger fish who are swimming in a stream. And an older fish comes up next to the two younger fish and says, "Hey, how does the water feel today? How's the temperature of the water feel?" And the two younger fish say, "Well, what's water? What is water?" And David Foster Wallace goes on to say, he says, the point of the fish story is that the most obvious realities around us are oftentimes the ones that we're least cognizant about just because we're immersed in them. We're just swimming in the waters of expressive individualism. Well, what are some of the hallmarks or some of the mantras of expressive individualism? You do you, free yourself, be your own person, do what makes you happy, live your own truth, be authentically you. This mantra, this engine powers and generates pretty much all of the marketing that you see today, whether it's music, movies, products. You go into a bookstore, you go to a self-help section or a self-care section. This is the flavor of what people are getting today. It is, listen, the goal for the individual is that you be a happy, authentic, genuine person. What we're going to do now is I want to play a video for you, keeping all of this in mind and keeping in mind what we just talked about. The individual's name that you'll see on this video, his name's Joseph Backholm, and he goes onto the campus of the University of Washington, and he interviews a bunch of different college students about gender and about identity. And I want you to keep in mind what we've already talked about, and then listen as you listen in on the replies and the answers that you get, because I think in so many ways it really will just further demonstrate where we're at.
There's been a lot of talk about identity lately, but how far does it go? And is it possible to be wrong? We went to the University of Washington to find out.
Are you aware of the debate happening in Washington State around the ability to access bathrooms, locker rooms, spas based on gender identity and gender expression?
I think people should be able to have access to the facility.
I think bathrooms could and potentially should be gender neutral because there doesn't need to be a classification for differences.
I think people definitely should have the ability to go into whichever locker room they want.
I feel like at least public universities should do their best to accommodate for those who do not have a specific gender identity.
You know, whether you identify as male or female and whether your sex at birth is matching to that, you should be able to utilize the resources.
So if I told you that I was a woman, what would your response be?
Good for you. Okay. Like, yeah.
Nice to meet you.
I'd be like, what? Really?
I don't have a problem with it.
I'd ask you how you came to that conclusion.
If I told you that I was Chinese, what would your response be?
I mean, I might be a little surprised, but I would say, good for you. Like, yeah, be who you are.
I would maybe think you had some Chinese ancestor.
I would ask you how you similarly came to that conclusion and why you came to that conclusion.
I would have a lot of questions just because on the outside I would assume that you're a white man.
If I told you that I was 7 years old, what would your response be?
I wouldn't believe that immediately.
I probably wouldn't believe it, but I mean, it wouldn't really bother me that much to go out of my way and tell you, no, you're wrong. I'd just be like, oh, okay, he wants to say he's 7 years old.
If you feel 7 at heart, then then so be it. Yeah, good for you.
So if I wanted to enroll in a first grade class, do you think I should be allowed to?
Probably not, I guess. I mean, unless you haven't completed first grade up to this point and for some reason need to do that now.
If that's where you feel like mentally you should be, then I feel like there are communities that would accept you for that.
I would say so long as you're not hindering society and you're not causing harm to other people, I feel like that should be an okay thing.
If I told you I'm 6 feet 5 inches, what would you say?
That I would question.
Why?
Because you're not. No, I don't think you're 6'5".
If you truly believed you're 6'5", I don't think it's harmful. I think it's fine if you believe that. It doesn't matter to me if you think you're taller than you are.
So you'd be willing to tell me I'm wrong?
I wouldn't tell you you're wrong.
No, but I say that I don't think that you are.
I feel like that's not my place.
as like another human to say someone is wrong or to draw lines or boundaries.
No, I mean, I wouldn't just go like, oh, you're wrong, like that's wrong to believe in it. Because I mean, again, it doesn't really bother me what you want to think about your height or anything.
So I can be a Chinese woman.
You sure.
But I can't be a 6'5" Chinese woman.
Yes.
If you thoroughly debated me or explained why you felt that you were 6'5", I feel like I would be very open to saying that you were 6'5", or Chinese, or a woman.
It shouldn't be hard to tell a 5'9" white guy that he's not a 6'5" Chinese woman. But clearly it is. Why? What does that say about our culture? And what does that say about our ability to answer the questions that actually are difficult?
Fascinating video, right? And what I hope you hear in all of the responses that back home was, as he was interviewing those students, is just the sincerity with which they're answering it. They're not trying to be funny. They're not trying to be facetious. In many ways, right, what Jonathan Haidt is reflecting earlier about how we come into a sense of who we are, right? You never want to tell anyone they're wrong. Whatever you want to be, that should be whoever it is. That should be what you are allowed to be. And you never want to tell anyone wrong. You want to live out your true and authentic self. And I think that that came through so much on the video. Well, to help us understand how we got to that spot, not only why people believe what they do, Desmond Tutu famously said, he said, instead of trying to pull people out of the downstream, maybe we should go upstream and find out why they're falling into the river. And that's what I want to do here at the front end, here in the middle portion of our talk, is to actually talk about identity formation. Because I think a lot of times when we have conversations around gender, we immediately go downstream. And we talk about pronouns and names and sports and bathrooms, and we easily get bogged down into downstream conversations that culturally end up putting us on opposite sides, because you're never going to convince somebody of the fact that, hey, I think that people should just be able to do whatever it is that they want to do. So I think oftentimes more fruitful conversations can happen if we actually understand how people come into a sense of who they are, and then identifying some of the problems with what I would call a modern identity formation process. So let's talk about how people develop an identity. I want to say at the outset, I have borrowed and learned a lot of this material from Tim Keller, and Tim had a really helpful talk at Redeemer that he gave, a series of 3 messages on gospel identity, and a lot of this content comes from those talks. But the first kind of identity that we'll talk about is what is known as a traditional identity formation process. And historically, this would have been the way for probably the first 1,500 years of human history that people came into a sense of who they were. Historically, identity was rooted in one's family or tribal relationships, your family of origin, your country, your clan, your tribe, your people, meaning that you did not get to choose who you wanted to be. That was already predetermined for you based off of whose family you were born into, what body you were born into, what country you were born into, what socioeconomic demographic you were born into.
We are thrilled to announce Rooted's new book with New Growth Press, The Jesus I Wish I Knew in High School, Asian American Edition. Being a teenager is itself an overwhelming experience. But the struggles unique to Asian American teenagers can often lead them to wonder if anyone truly knows what they're going through. In this book, 12 authors come alongside Asian American students to share their own high school experiences, helping students to see how Jesus makes a difference in our unique struggles. Jesus sees them and knows them fully. These testimonies of growing up Asian American include struggles with belonging, performance pressure, fear of failure, living in an honor-shame culture, eating disorders, sexual assault, and adoption. The writers now walk faithfully with Jesus in their ethnic and cultural distinctions. These stories lift up the Asian American experience with dignity, offering representation and belonging. We hope you'll read this book and share it with the Asian American teenagers in your home or church.
What was the goal of traditional identity? Well, the goal of traditional identity was to be a good person. It was to live a good and an honorable life. And early philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle said there's this cosmic good that orders our universe, these virtues of trust and honesty and fidelity and friendship and love. And it is our goal as we're living out our identity to align ourselves with this cosmic order of good. We want to be honorable, virtuous, kind individuals. In early times, this sacrifice or this goodness or this honorable life was very tied to whatever gender it was that you were born into. So for men, the goal would have been to do whatever it was that your father did, to follow in your father's footsteps. So if you grew up in 5th century England and your dad was a baker, well, then guess what you were going to be? You were going to be a baker. You were going to do whatever it was that your dad or your family or your great-grandfather had done for all of time, and that was one of the ways that you fulfilled your obligations as a person. Now, the height of that, in many ways, if we were to kind of mythologize it, would have been to give oneself up for the good of other people, kind of like this heroic, self-sacrificial model. Probably the two major movies that we're all familiar with that maybe exemplify this traditional identity would be movies like Gladiator or Braveheart. Those would be movies that exemplify this male traditional identity mindset that I am going to heroically give myself up for the good of those around me. For women, it was much less glamorous and much more domestic. The goal for women in a traditional identity mindset was to get married and to have lots and lots of children. That was really the goal for women. There was not this mindset where women could be whoever they wanted to be, where they could have a life and a vocation outside of the home. They were really there to help support the husband, to keep the home, and to have lots and lots of children to continue on the family line. The measure of success in traditional identity, the people who got to say, listen, this is you doing a good job at fulfilling your identity, it was a group of people that were outside of you, namely your parents or your culture. It was people that were in positions of authority or power saying, listen, well done, you've made it. You have brought honor to the family. Well, that traditional mindset shifted right around the Age of Enlightenment into what I would say is the dominant identity formation process today, which is modern identity. In modern identity, the location of power of who gets to determine one's identity moves from the outside and it moves to the inside. You are now sovereign, right? You are a sovereign self, as John Stuart Mill called it. You get to determine whoever it is that you want to be. The highest good in modern identity is not to be a good person. That was traditional identity. In modern identity, the goal is to be a happy person, to be an authentic person. If you've had conversations with teenagers, which I'm assuming most of you have, that desire for happiness and authenticity comes out in a lot of different ways in a lot of different conversations. That the goal of thriving and flourishing is that you are authentic, that you are being true to yourself. To live an authentic life, then, is the defining feature in success in modern identity. Jean-Jacques Rousseau writes this. He says, the individual is at his best. He is most truly himself as he should be when he acts in accordance with his nature, right? And whatever that is, right? If that even means that as a biological male, you feel more authentically yourself by identifying as a female, well, then nobody should be telling you not to do that. You should live out whatever it is that you want to. Now, while the appeal of modern identity is there, I think that there are a number of problems and critiques with it. And what we're going to do now is I want to describe for you 5 different problems with modern identity that, if you can imagine them, I would envision them as pathways of conversation. They're pathways of conversation that you can have with teens and youth, children, young adults, to begin picking away at what I would say would be an errant theology as it relates to gender and as it relates to sexuality. And it's a way that you can come at the conversation without just immediately saying, well, the Bible says this about sex and gender, which we've already said at the front end is not how today culturally most students and teens have conversations about sex and gender. So here's the first one. Here's the first problem with modern identity is that it's ultimately an incoherent way to build out one sense of identity, right? In modern identity, you dig deep inside your feelings, you figure it out who it is that you want to be, and you go out into the world and you proclaim it and you demand acceptance for it. But our feelings, while being good, are not reliable enough to stake our entire identity on. Nancy Pearcey writes this. She says, though our feelings are important, they are not what define our identity, nor are they a reliable guide to God's purposes. Because we are fallen and sinful, our feelings fluctuate over time. The most reliable marker of who we are is our physically embodied, God-given identity as male and female. Right? There are many times, just even think about your own feelings, right? There are probably times when you don't feel like going to work. There are probably times for those of you who are parents where you feel like not wanting to be a parent. You don't want to do carpool. You don't want to have to pay that school fee. You don't want to have to drive that kid to another practice. There's probably many times, like on April 15th, where you don't feel like being an American taxpayer, right? There are so many things where if we just dug deep into our feelings and lived out whatever feeling it was, it would probably lead us down a lot of different paths that ultimately would not be helpful. What we realize then is that feelings are good. They're a good part of God's design for us, but feelings make good passengers and bad drivers, right? If we're using the analogy of a car, right? Feelings are good, but if you put them in the driver's seat, if you put them in the primary driver's seat of identity, you're probably going to be in a spot where ultimately your identity is going to become quite incoherent. Brian Rosner writes this. He says, the cruel irony is that while it's never been more important to know who you are, it's rarely been more difficult. And why is it so difficult? Because all of you who lead and shepherd and guide teens and children, right, what do we know about their feelings? Their feelings are constantly in flux. Their feelings are constantly in change. I met with a family in a counseling consultation just this past week, and their son is 17. He's pursuing a gender transition. And one of the things that they noted, they said those feelings tend to cease. They tend to significantly lessen in their fervor when he goes to this one Christian camp. He goes to this Christian camp with our high school ministry every summer at church. And they said every time he comes back, he's a different person. He's less hostile, he's less adversarial. Conversations about him wanting to transition significantly decrease. And they said it's almost like when he's at this camp and he's with people who love him and are investing in him, all of those feelings and all of those conversations significantly subside. And then he comes back to school, he's back on his phone, he's back with his friends, and suddenly all of those feelings, right, they suddenly come back up again. And I said, well, perhaps that's a conversation point, right, then that you can have with your son, right? If at one point he feels a certain way, in a certain spot, in a certain environment, and then suddenly just being in a different spot, in a different setting with different people is enough to change those feelings, right? Wouldn't that give you pause to really consider making a life-altering decision just simply based on your feelings, right? If we're going to make some of these significant decisions about our gender, about our biological future, just simply based on a feeling, I think one of the things that we have to help teens and children especially understand is that feelings are good, but they're ultimately not the most reliable marker of who our true identity should be centered on. Second major problem with modern identity is that it's crushing. It's really a crushing way to build out a sense of who you are. In modern identity, the burden of self-definition lies with you, the individual. So while the positive is that you get to define yourself, most people realize ultimately that the burden of self-definition is a crushing one. Because how do you both generate and now sustain your own identity? And what happens then in this model is that it becomes a never-ending cycle of performing your identity for the watching world. You have to constantly express who you are, and you have to get the approval of those from around you. Christopher Watkins writes this. He says, the fact that we are in the image of God and are not God therefore prevents us from thinking too highly of ourselves. It also prevents us from assuming the burden of defining ourselves. It reminds us that we are not the final court of appeal in questions about our own identity. I don't ultimately own or define myself. One of the questions that I'm encouraging parents to ask their teens and their children and those who might be considering some type of transition or gender change is, listen, do you think at the end of the day, being 14 or 15 or 16, do you think that you're strong enough, smart enough, wise enough to be the final authority, judge, and jury on this most important issue? right? Most people at least have some realization of their limitations, right? I'm not smart enough, I'm not strong enough, I'm not wise enough. But yet what we're telling people is that one of the most important life tasks, figuring out who it is that you are smart enough for that. You are strong enough for that. And not only are you smart enough to figure this out, but you're also strong enough for over the duration of your entire life to be able to sustain this identity. And friends, that is a crushing burden, I think, to put on children and teens today. Number 3, modern identity at the end of the day is quite fragile. So for all of its vaunted senses of self-sufficiency and creativity and independence, it's actually quite fragile. And here's what I mean by that. In traditional identity, remember, your identity is stable because whether or not you like your identity or not, you're stuck with it, right? Again, Bobby, who's living in 15th century England, whose dad's a farmer, he might say, well, I don't want to be a farmer, right? I'm going to go be an explorer. And everybody around him say, well, that's not your choice. This is who you are. You're going to be a farmer. You're going to inherit the family farm, right? There's no sense of fragility. There's actually a lot of rigidity to it, right? There's no choice. You just do whatever it is that you're told to do. But in modern identity, you have to dig deep into your feelings, figure out who it is that you are, then go out into society and demand acceptance and affirmation and approval. But guess what happens, though, if somebody pushes back on that? What happens if somebody doesn't affirm you? What happens if your parents don't affirm you? What happens if culturally people don't affirm you? Ultimately, then those people are what? They're bigoted, they're racist, they're fundamentalists, they're people who don't care, right? So some of the dialogue oftentimes that teens and children come into these conversations with is, listen, if you can't affirm my choice, then what? Then you don't love me. If you can't accept me for who I am, then listen, I have to cut you out of my life because you're toxic. But wait a minute. If your identity is self-generated, if it's actually something that you came up with on your own, and the only person whose approval and strength and wisdom and smartness that you need to come up with that identity is yourself, who cares what other people think about you, right? Who cares what your mom and dad think about you? Who cares what your pastor thinks about you? If your sense of identity is self-generated and it only matters what you think about yourself, why do you so desperately need the approval of your parents, of people around you, right? And that's part of the problem with modern identity is it acts like it's really strong, but there's an incredible fragility to it, right? I'll have parents coming and telling me, listen, my daughter said that if I don't fully accept everything that she wants about her sexual identity or gender identity, that she has to cut me out, right? That she has to excise me from her life, right? That's a fragility that doesn't match on with the strength of what modern identity promises. Number 4, the fourth problem is modern identity is ultimately an exhausting way to do identity. That's why I think a lot of times, especially in conversations, some more of the mantras or monikers that you'll hear is that you have to fight for acceptance. You have to fight to find your voice, right? There's a lot of fighting that happens culturally as it relates to identity, which is, again, ironic if everybody's just trying to be their authentic self and just trying to be happy. Why aren't more people happy if we're telling everybody, listen, the goal of modern identity is to be happy, and if you do that, you'll be happy, but everybody seems to be depressed and anxious and not happy. Taylor Swift, who's, I think, a great cultural commentator of our own day, here's what she said in 2022 at the NYU commencement ceremony. She says, "We are so many things all the time." That's very much a head nod to modern identity. And she says, "I know it can be overwhelming figuring out who to be, but," she says, "I have some good news. It's totally up to you. But I also have some terrifying news. It is totally up to you." Right? That, I think, in so many ways, whether or not she intended to or not, puts the finger on the pulse of what so much of our struggle is today, right? We have told a generation of people, be whoever it is that you want to be. And in pursuing whoever it is that you want to be, you are going to be so happy. You are going to be living your authentic self. But guess what? Here's the not-so-silver lining in the midst of that. All of this now, though, is up to you. Because if you're being told, listen, you determine your own happiness, friends, that is an incredible, crushing burden to also put on yourself. Because whose fault is it then that you're unhappy? Whose fault is it then that you're not living out your authentic self, right? We oftentimes want to put the blame on other people, but ultimately, in terms of its ideology, that responsibility comes back to the individual. Alan Noble writes this. He says, the freedom of sovereign individualism comes at an extremely great price. He says, once you're liberated from all social, moral, natural, and religious values, he says, you become responsible for the meaning of your own life. With no God to judge or justify me, I have to be my own judge and redeemer. This burden manifests as a desperate need to justify our lives through identity crafting and expression. But because everyone else is also working frantically to craft and express their own identity, society becomes a space of vicious competition between individuals vying for attention, meaning, and significance. Right? Even, I would say, the very acronym of how we describe non-heteronormative sexual identities, that has changed over our lifetime. Right? 20 years ago, there were probably 4 letters. It was L, G, B, and a T. And now there are hundreds of different identifications, right? When we think about this need to constantly perform our identity, well, there's always going to be somebody out there that's doing a better job of it than you are. There's always somebody going to be out there living their more authentic self that pushes you to have to do that. And friends, that is a crushing rat race to find yourself in, which I think is why so many times what we're seeing on the mental health side as it relates to children and teens is expressing itself in the most high rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidality of any other generation. The number one demographic of people pursuing mental health today are people ages 18 to 35. 1 out of every 3 18 to 35-year-olds are pursuing mental health treatment, which doesn't make any sense if we're supposed to be the happiest, most authentic generation.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Kwame, and I have been serving in youth ministry at Centennial Church in Forest Lake, Minnesota for more than 20 years. I'm also the author of More to the Story, Deep Answers to Real Questions on Attraction, Identity, and Relationships. And I've had the honor to write Rooted's new curriculum on biblical sexuality. It's a 9-week short study that goes through key passages in Scripture about the topic of human sexuality. And our hope and prayer with it is that it would help students to see why their sexuality matters so much and how they can honor God with their bodies and their relationships. We also hope and pray that it is a tool for you as you navigate the tough questions that our students are asking with gospel truth.
Number 5, the 5th problem with modern identity is that ultimately it's an illusion. And here's what I mean by that. It's an illusion in the sense of where did this message of be whoever it is that you want to be, live your true self, who actually came up with that message? Was it the individual or was it the culture? Right? It was culture. And so the illusion of modern identity is, listen, you're actually the one making the choice to live your authentic self, but the illusion of it is no, you're actually not making that choice. Guess who made the choice for you? It was the culture around you. There's probably a lot of great scenes that illustrate this, but one of my favorites is this scene with Meryl Streep and Anne Hathaway in The Devil Wears Prada. So I'm going to play this clip, and then we'll talk about it.
Where are the belts for this dress? Why is no one ready?
Here. It's a tough call. They're so different.
Something funny?
No, nothing's, it's just that both those belts look exactly the same to me. I'm still learning about this stuff and,
This stuff? Oh, okay. I see. You think this has nothing to do with you. You go to your closet and you select, I don't know, that lumpy blue sweater, for instance, because you're trying to tell the world that you take yourself too seriously to care about what you put on your back. But what you don't know is that sweater is not just blue. It's not turquoise. It's not lapis. It's actually cerulean. And you're also blithely unaware of the fact that in 2002, Oscar de la Renta did a collection of cerulean gowns. And then I think it was Yves Saint Laurent, wasn't it, who showed cerulean military jackets? I think we need a jacket here. And then cerulean quickly showed up in the collections of 8 different designers. And then it filtered down through the department stores and then trickled on down into some tragic casual corner where you no doubt fished it out of some clearance bin. However, that blue represents millions of dollars and countless jobs And it's sort of comical how you think that you've made a choice that exempts you from the fashion industry when in fact you're wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room from a pile of stuff.
It's a great scene, isn't it? They're actually coming out with a second one, which I'm excited about. But, here's the point in that clip, right? Anne Hathaway's character, she's living her authentic self. She's like, you know what? I'm really sticking it to all the runway people. I'm going to wear this really lumpy blue sweater that I got at a Goodwill, and I'm going to tell everybody at runway, I don't care what you think about me. I don't have to look how you want me to look. And what Meryl Streep's character does in such an incisive way, she says, listen, you think that you're making your own choice to be authentic and be true to yourself, but what you don't realize is that a long time ago, a bunch of cultural elites in a room like this, we were the ones who said, listen, this is going to be the color. This is going to be the color of the season. This is going to be the color that everyone is going to want to wear, and we're going to make that choice for everybody in the culture. And so what's so ironic, right, for Anne Hathaway's character is that she thinks that she's making the choice to be authentically herself, but that choice was actually predetermined by people in that room, Meryl Streep is saying. And that same thing, I think, is happening with kids and teens today, right? Kids and teens are not smart enough to come up with this ideology all on their own of living out their authentic self. They're not reading Charles Taylor. They're not reading Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Camille Paglia or any other gender ideologists. It's just happening through the marketing. It's happening through the cultural impact. And that, friends, is one of the biggest problems with modern identity. Jeremy Treat writes this. He says, it's so interesting how being true to yourself usually just means aligning with some mainstream cultural narrative. Trevin Wax writes, he says, we think that we're blazing our own paths, but curiously, the paths that we take are actually looking strangely like everyone else's. And John Mark Comer writes this. He says, the irony of our be true to yourself is that everyone ends up looking the same. So American individualism actually becomes American conformity. And we don't have time to talk about it, but that's actually one of the beauties of the gospel. Is that the beauty of the gospel is not that it demands conformity and uniformity, but that within the unity that we have in the Spirit, there's a beautiful diversity that can happen. The exact opposite is what happens with modern identity. So, what do we need in the midst of all of that? I believe we need a gospel identity. A lot of times when I do this seminar, especially people who are in Gen X or baby boomers, they'll say, yeah, this is why we got to get back to traditional identity. We got to get back to a time where, kids respected their parents and parents could put their kids in their place. And no, we could spend a lot of time talking about all the problems with traditional identity too. There's a lot of good, but there's also a lot of downside in traditional identity too, especially in the ways that it squeezed men and women into preset gender roles that look nothing as to what, or did not really account for how God designed and created us to be. But we don't have time to cover that. So I don't think it's either traditional or modern. The real identity that we're trying to communicate to people is a gospel identity. It is an identity that is received and not achieved. Listen to what Jesus says in Matthew 10:39. He says, whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Right? In many ways, this kind of encapsulates what we're seeing in culturally, is that we've told a generation of kids and teens, listen, go find yourself. Go find out your true self. And what has ended up happening is that they are more lost than ever. And the message of the gospel is, no, lose yourself first, and in losing yourself, you will find yourself in Christ. John Stott says, the astonishing paradox of Christ's teaching and of Christian experience is this, is that if we lose ourselves in following Christ, we actually find ourselves. True self-denial is self-discovery. And Alan Noble writes this. He says, there's no image in gospel identity for you to maintain because you were already made in the image of God. There's no identity for you to discover or create because our identity was never actually in question. So with all that by way of background, if in many ways what I'm trying to do in this first two-thirds of the talk is to help us to go upstream to find out why people are falling in the downstream. And I think in that process, understanding how people form their identity is absolutely critical for us to understand as parents, as caregivers, as ministry leaders. So in the time that we have, what I want to do now is to go into the downstream to say, okay, how do we actually do this then? How do we actually, as people who are tasked with and stewarded with the care of souls of children and teens and families in our church, how can we help engage people on these conversations related to gender? And I'm just going to offer some really low-hanging fruit that every single person will be able to utilize in their own conversations. The first of which is just really seek to understand their struggle. I think a lot of times we add more distance in these conversations because for us, we might not ever have had an experience of having discomfort with our gender. We might not have ever had a sense of incongruence with our gender, right? If I asked everybody and polled everybody in this room and said, hey, have you ever felt uncomfortable with your gender? That percentage might be quite low. But you ask a teen today, you ask a child today, and that number might be a lot higher. And so a lot of times we can distance ourselves from those conversations because it seems like an experience that it's incredibly unfamiliar with us. But one of the things I try to encourage parents and people who are navigating these conversations with people who are considering transitioning is proximity always increases empathy. So the closer we can get to the individual, both physically but more figuratively, relationally, the better we can have connected and empathetic conversations. To be able to ask some of those questions of, well, tell me a little bit about this struggle. Why are you thinking this? What are some of the things that are discomforting for you? I will tell you this, that one of the first things that oftentimes pops up in gender dysphoria conversations, gender incongruence conversations, is not so much that they are discomforted or uncomfortable with their physical embodied gender, but that they are uncomfortable with preset stereotypes or caricatures of their gender, right? So I have a 17-year-old girl at a Christian school who just says, I just am not into all of the other things that girls at my school are into. Like, I want to play music, I want to be in a band, I want to dress in this particular way. And when we begin dialoguing about all of those things, there's nothing explicitly that she's either telling me or her parents that would require her to change genders, right? That would require her to go from female to male. But culturally, the stereotypes that she's inculcated and taken on herself are leading her to believe that's incompatible with being a female. And so understanding individual struggles, I think, is so important. Mark Yarhouse, who's done a lot of great work in this area, says, if you've met one transgender person, you've met one transgender person, right? Every person's story is unique, and so spending a lot of time understanding the story and asking good questions is an important part of building rapport, and I think really shepherding and guiding the children and teens that God has entrusted to us. Number two, check your reactions and your responses. Normally what I'm trying to help coach parents on is don't overreact and don't underreact. We tend to be, again, in a binary, we tend to either overreact or underreact. And a lot of times in family systems, I'll find a mother and a father tend to be on opposite ends of the spectrum. Maybe one of the parents will want to overreact and one of the parents will want to underreact. And what I would say here is, what does it look like first to identify where you might be on that spectrum? Do you tend to be an overreactor? Do you tend to be an underreactor? And then what does moving towards the middle look like? What does thoughtful, wise, discerning engagement look like? Mark Yarhouse writes this. He says, a passing interest in mom's clothing or various secondary sex characteristics is probably not a sign of dysphoria. These interests happen quite often. He says, I would encourage parents not to be anxious when your child expresses an interest that is gender atypical or otherwise falls outside of rigid gender stereotypes. This kind of thing is common and does not persist in most cases. Statistically, we know that most gender dysphoria resolves itself without any type of hormonal or medical intervention in 80 to 90% of those cases. 80 to 90% of cases of kids who are expressing gender dysphoric feelings who don't undergo some type of medical intervention or hormonal treatment end up resolving those feelings over time. One of the things that I would say in many ways is just a God-given mechanism to helping to resolve some of those feelings would be puberty. right? That puberty is a natural process that everyone goes through that oftentimes helps alleviate and helps people move through some of those feelings of dysphoria and incongruence. So one of the big things that we're seeing right now in counseling and mental health and in medicine is we are preventing people from going through puberty, which is actually one of the things I think that is just a God-given designed process to help actually engage and to interact some of those feelings of dysphoria and incongruence. So in conversations with parents, helping them navigate what their own responses are. I had one dad in my office, and his daughter was considering transitioning, and he said, I just can't even look at her anymore. I can't even look at her. And we had a lot of conversations about that and some of his own prejudices and different ways that he had grown up. But if that's a response then that you bring into the home, that you bring into the dinner table, that you bring into conversation, right, what's that going to do to your ability to maintain relationship with your daughter through some of these conversations, right? We have to be mindful of our own reactions and responses as parents. Number 3, address confusion early and honestly. I would say, what does a healthy reaction look like if we're not telling people to underreact or overreact? What I would say is address that confusion early and honestly. When people are expressing dissonance or a sense of incongruence with their physical embodied gender in their feelings, address that. Talk about that. There are so many helpful resources that over the past 4 or 5 years have come out that literally give you scripts, conversational prompts, ways that you can navigate these conversations. I think sometimes parents get afraid of these things. They want to contact a professional, and if you contact a professional counselor and you send them down that route, just know that ethically, counselors and mental health professionals that don't hold to a Christian faith are required ethically to promote a gender ideology that goes against our beliefs and how God designed and created us. Number 4, maintain relationship. I tell parents this all the time. Do whatever you can to maintain relationship. I think that in most occasions and in most situations, you are able to do this. Whatever it takes to maintain the relationship, I would do, because it's within the context of a relationship that we have the opportunity for influence, right? If we want to have a gospel influence with our kid and our teens' lives, and after they become adults, then we want to maintain that relationship. When we try to have influence outside the context of a relationship, we call that manipulation, right? When we are exercising godly influence, it needs to happen within the context of a relationship. And oftentimes I find, especially teens and young adults whose choices don't map onto their parents, will say, listen, all my parents want to do is to change me. They don't care about a relationship with me. They just disagree with my choice, and that's all that they want to communicate to me. And I tell parents all the time, listen, don't fall into that trap. Don't make every single conversation about gender and about transitioning. There's a lot of things that you can build relationship on apart from making this the centerpiece and the center point of every single interaction. Don't have to tell all of you, I encourage parents this, but to disciple their children. And I think a lot of times we just forget this as parents. I think that we oftentimes think that this is not a job that we have to do, but hey, our youth pastor will do it, people at church will do it, our Christian school teachers will do it. But so much of the discipleship of our children has probably been, I would say, outsourced to other sources, and trying to get parents and caregivers to engage in the discipleship of their children as early and as often as possible is something that is key. Howard Hendricks, the late Howard Hendricks, said, we should never be ashamed to discuss what God was not ashamed to create. We should never be ashamed to discuss what God was not ashamed to create. And so my encouragement to parents is it's never too early to start and it's never too late to start. Right, that family that I had in my office a couple of weeks ago that had a 17-year-old son, he turns 18 in June, and they were really nervous. They were really worried that they had missed the bus. And I said, well, what does it look like to reclaim these next 6 months that you have before some of those choices are his to make and don't require your assent? What does that 6 months look like? That 6 months is not something you just want to give up or to throw away. So in the discipleship of children, talk early and talk often. Next, speak truth in love. right? We do want to speak boldly and honestly, right? I think about Proverbs 27, 5-6, where the author says, better is open rebuke than hidden love. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, and the kisses of an enemy are deceitful, right? Sometimes you might be more on the underreactor side of things, and you might say, well, listen, I don't want to make the situation worse. I hear a lot of parents say that. I'm afraid if I actually tell them what I think, that they will push me away. They'll cut me out of relationship. But friends, I think a part of our role, not only as Christians, but as parents, as individuals, as human beings, we are called to speak truth in love. Better is open rebuke than hidden love. I love it. Bruce Waltke, who's an Old Testament commentator, has a great line about hidden love. He says, hidden love is like winking at a girl in the dark. It doesn't do you or her any good. And I think it's such a memorable way to put it, and it's a memorable way to understand that proverb, that as a parent, as a person who has influence with children and teens, don't hide your love. Don't keep it in the dark. Be honest and forthright about your convictions and about what the Bible has to say about these issues. So, all that being said, I hope these are then at least some helpful downstream ways that you can help equip parents to have some of these conversations. I will tell you this statistically, that one of the number one indicators of children and teens having positive mental health experiences, you know what it is? It's maintaining a loving and trusting relationship with their parents. That when you think about all of the different factors, all the different things that could go wrong in this world, medication, mental health diagnoses, that the number one indicator that we are seeing from the research that helps children and teens navigate through these tough cultural waters is when they are able to maintain strong connections and relationships with their parents. Now, again, that's not a Christian saying that. That's just secular research, just noting the power and the influence that parents have in their children's lives. So I applaud and so thankful for all of the work that you guys are doing with parents in your own local churches. Like I mentioned earlier, you can get all of this information, the resource guide, the parent resource guide that has a bunch of different questions that kind of mirror those problems on modern identity that we talked about. If you yourself are looking for resources or counseling resources for children, teens, or families, we do a lot of those consultations at Fieldstone and would encourage you to check that out. I think as was mentioned at the very beginning, if you're looking to dive into it more, those topics about identity, not just gender, but also sexual orientation. The book that I just came out with New Growth Press called Grounded in Grace covers gender dysphoria, sexual orientation, and then 3 other areas of identity struggle that kids and teens have: sports, academics, and then Christian moralism, just being a good person. And the book kind of gets divided up into I am what I do and I am what I feel, and trying to engage conversations about you aren't just solely what you do and you aren't just solely what you feel. You are who God says you are.